Hey everyone, so today to start off our sociocultural unit, we're going to be talking about the social identity theory. And this first part of our sociocultural unit is really going to talk about two main theories, this being the first of them. Um, so let's get into it. So the social identity theory refers to the ways that individuals think about who they are and then evaluate themselves in relation to groups. So according to the theory, an individual's sense of who they are is based on being a member or not a member of a particular group. And this was developed by two researchers, TAJFEL and Turner, in 1979, who said that there were three different mental processes that helped us to evaluate whether we were part of us or them. And these two, the us being the in-group, the them being the out-group. And these three processes were social categorization, social identification, and then social comparison. And we'll talk about them more as we go here. So before we first get into it, I want you to just pause the video and ask yourself what your feelings are about Colonial Forge High School, what your feelings are about the other high schools in Stafford, and then why is Mountain View the best high school in Stafford? So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. All right, so now that you've answered, you may be saying to yourself, well, the kids over at Colonial Forge are snobby or stuck up or arrogant, or that you really don't like that school over there. And that'd be, totally consistent with what I've heard in the past. Uh, but the funny thing is that when I talk to other people about Mountain View High School, uh, they say the same exact things about us, right? And so this may, point towards a larger messaging about how we sort of form these in groups and out groups. Yes, you may have friends over at Colonial Forge, and that may color your view a little bit, but at the end of the day, you're still categorizing yourself into an us versus them thing, even though you guys are all from the same county. So social categorization is really the first step in this social identity theory, and it's a cognitive process. It's where the individual divides the social world into those that belong to their particular group or the in-group, and then those who do not, and that's called the out-group. And I love my little uh, squiggly line there. So this ends up focusing on the common ground between people inside the group and then highlights the differences from people outside the group. And these could be constructed by any number of factors. We talked about one right now, high schools, right? It could be divided on classes. It could be divided on IB students versus non-IB students, or IB students versus AP students, or I'm in the culinary program and you're not, right? We categorize ourselves based on all of these different things. I'm part of this friend group and you're not. I'm part of this family and you're not, right? There's all these different ways in which we categorize ourselves socially, and that could go along the lines of like even things where we may have a lot of groups in common with people from our out group, but in this particular way that we're talking about, we do not align. Like, kids in the same high school liking different football teams. One's a Steelers fan and one's a Washington football team fan, right? So all of these different ways in which we sort of categorize ourselves. The second one, social identification. This is the second stage. This is the behavioral and cognitive process where the individual adopts the identity and behavioral norms of the group. So first, we've sort of categorized ourselves into they're over there, we're over here, right? And so again, we start to adopt and identify what the behavioral norms and how to fit in with our in-group is. So for instance, if a 15-year-old wanted to be a police officer, they're too young at this point, but they may start to conform to the identities of a police officer. Maybe they become a safety monitor, right? Maybe they join certain organizations that are based on sort of discipline and rule following and those sorts of things. And really outside of this example, when we're thinking about this, the norms end up becoming defined by the group. And these behavioral norms can extend to sociocultural cognitions, bias, prejudice, discrimination. If you're trying to adapt to a norm, adapt to a group where that is part of the behavioral processes. So social identification and later on social identity really is based on how we view ourselves, or what is called self-concept. I'm sorry for crossing out that the word there. But if you, for instance, think that you had a good sense of humor, maybe you start to classify which groups you would fit in with based on that. So maybe you look at friend groups where a lot of the people are funny, or they get your sense of humor, and you think I belong with them, or you think I would make a good stand-up comedian or something like that. And self-identification can really express its different behaviors in different environments. So for instance, a teacher may be warm and nice and friendly outside of school, but demanding and rigid in school because they identify as a teacher, and their particular conception of how those norms should play out in terms of behavior changes their behavior and self-concept. And this is based on an idea of intergroup behavior. So relating to someone as a group, as a member of the in-group, and rather than as one human being to another, right? So if you're not part of this group, I'm going to treat you like you're not part of this group instead of looking at someone as a human being. And so we end up tending to become tied to the roles that we are playing instead of allowing our true feelings to guide our behaviors towards another person. So we're going to, in the PowerPoint version, you can watch a clip here from the classic 90s TV show, Boy Meets World, in which Mr. Feeney talks about our perception of others, right? And how we fit into these different groups. Also with social identification, if we're looking at intergroup behavior, the opposite of that would be interpersonal behavior. So again, relating to someone as one human to another, right? And not as members of an in-group would to an outsider. And so these come from our own personality and not the norms that are set in place by the group. And so our social identity, at the end of the day, allows us to see ourselves having a place in the particular groups that you value. And the theory itself explains how some people sometimes try hard to change their lifestyles to fit into a particular group. So the third stage of the social identity theory is social comparison. And this determines where our in-group stands relative to those out-groups, right? So you've, categorized yourselves along common lines in social categorization. You've started to conform to the norms and behaviors of your particular group, but you haven't really compared yourselves to how you differ from other groups, right? And so like we did with the Colonial Forge discussion, we often emphasize the positive distinctiveness of your own particular in-group and why it is a good place to belong to, and why it is good to belong to this particular group. And once we end up identifying to a specific group, we try to see how favorably our in-group compares with other out-groups. And so our self-esteem oftentimes becomes based on the favorability of being with a particular group, right? So once you choose a college or university to go to, you've chosen that because you possibly think it's the best, right? But if you're someone who views your current college or university as being really bad, what does that say particularly about you? And so that affects how we view ourselves as well. And that's the same reason why things like college sports teams become so important to the landscape of the university, because oftentimes we are comparing ourselves to other schools, right? If you have a particularly good basketball or football team, you start to have bragging rights over your friends who may go to other schools where their teams are not as good, or vice versa. And again, this is the final stage. Once we have categorized ourselves as part of a group and identified with that group, we then compare ourselves to other groups. Now, like I said earlier, oftentimes our social cognitions for prejudice and discrimination can come into play with this particular theory. And social comparison in particular helps us to explain prejudice and discrimination. When we identify ourselves as rivals to another group, we often need our members to feel that belonging to that particular group continues to support their high self-esteem in order to support the in-group. And so this competition and hostility can sometimes be important factors in competition for resources and lead to greater discrimination and prejudice in pursuit for those resources. And so those that are in the out group then have to prove themselves, or those who are trying to join the in group oftentimes have to prove themselves by adhering to harsher rules than the rest of the group in order to join the group. You almost have to, this is sort of the idea behind hazing, right? So if you're joining a fraternity or sorority, maybe you have harsher rules than the people who are already members of the group in order to show loyalty to the group. Gangs operate along similar terms. So this leads us into our first study for today. This is from TAJFEL, the man who created or helped create this theory. This is a study from 1971. And, the main understanding behind this is that when there is the mere fact of belonging to two different groups, even if they're along trivial lines, right, like factors and characteristics that wouldn't be cared about outside of this particular situation, this can trigger in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination, right? So even in unimportant things, this can lead to some of these symptoms of society that we've talked about here. So the aim was to investigate the effects of social categorization on intergroup behavior, right? How do people treat people outside of their in-group? And so they took 64 male students, ages 14 to 15, at a school in Bristol, England, where they all came from the same school. They all knew each other well. And they were tested in 8 groups of 8. So they split them up along those lines at first. And there were a couple stages to this. So in stage 1, there was categorization. So at first, they were shown 40 slides at less than a second each, with clusters of dots on a screen, and then requested to estimate the number of dots on each screen. And then they were split into different groups. And this would be based on the task where they estimated the number of dots on the screen. So in stage 2, there was a distribution of rewards. So once they split them into teams along these trivial lines of 4 overestimators and 4 underestimators, they were again told that they had to distribute rewards and penalties in real money to others. And they were given a booklet with 18 matrices, and some of the matrices in the booklet involved 2 members of the different groups. Some matrices, the choice was between 2 anonymous members of the in-group, and then some, it was 2 anonymous members of the out-group. And then the participants always allotted money to others, never to themselves. And again, they were all anonymous. They were just told whether they were part of the in-group, the out-group, what have you. And what they found was that oftentimes people allotted more rewards to people in their in-group versus their out-group, right? Even though they didn't know the identity of the person, and even though they would never be found out to have given more to the in-group than the out-group, they oftentimes gave more to their own team. And so the conclusion was that participants often demonstrate in-group favoritism and out-group discrimination when categorized into groups, even based on these trivial criteria, right? There was no real there was no strong traits that led to someone being part of a particular group or not. And there was a random assignment to it. But even then, they gave more points to people on their team. So a few strengths: it was replicable. It's been repeated in different forms with similar results. And it really demonstrated the minimal group concept. And we're going to talk about what the minimal group paradigm is in just a second. But the limitations were that there's possible limited application. These were all boys in their early teens. Maybe competition between those boys is much stronger. Maybe they saw it as a game. And it only showed discriminatory behavior in that the particular situation of being required to make decisions. They only showed preference when having to choose between rewarding an in-grouper or an out-grouper. And there was no actual evidence of hostility between the groups. So it was just that they rewarded people in their group a little bit more. So the minimal group paradigm that I talked about real quick on the last slide, in order to create the effects of social categorization in the experiment, certain conditions had to be met. So there was no face-to-face interaction. There should be no anonymity regarding group membership. There was only anonymity in the identity of the person, not group membership. The criteria for social categorization must be very trivial. The responses should not have any economic value. They were just rewarded these points that really didn't, mean anything. The strategy of in-group favoritism should be in competition with a strategy based on rationality. There was more benefit to all through this. And then the decisions made in the experiment should involve some real outcomes. In the end, maybe real money should be used, and not just symbolic tokens given. So in Bandura 1961, which is our next study, they used the social learning theory, but it was also using the social identity theory as well. And we'll talk about why. So the aim was to demonstrate that learning can occur through mere observation of a model, and that imitation can take place in the absence of a model. And so aggression can be learned through observation and imitation. So they took 36 boys and 36 girls, ages 3 to 6, and they split them into similarly composed groups. So group 1 observed adult models who showed aggression by bashing an inflated Bobo doll. Group 2 observed a non-aggressive adult who assembled toys. Group 3 did not see any model. And group 1 and 2, some saw same-sex models of behavior, some saw other sex models of behavior. So in some groups, boys saw a boy model or a male model. In some groups, girls saw female models. And then in some groups, boys saw female models, girls saw male models. Right? And they were, after viewing these particular models, they were all put into a room full of toys. And the toys were taken away, and they were told that the toys were for other children, which would provoke them. And the only toy they ended up being given was a Bobo doll. And a Bobo doll is one of those dolls that you hit, and it goes down, and it comes back up. So what it showed was that those exposed to aggression at the earlier stage showed significantly more aggression towards the Bobo doll than children not exposed to aggression. And boys were also more likely to imitate the physical aggression they had seen from men, girls more likely to imitate aggression they had seen from women. And so it shows a sort of social categorization taking place. And they're also identifying themselves based on these grounds to follow the behaviors of those from the same group, right? They're developing in-group, out-group relationships because boys are following boys, girls are following girls. So there's a few strengths. The study does appear to support social learning theory and social identity theory. And then there's also ecological validity in that it took place in a lab. But there's a few confounding variables along the lines of children not relating the beating of the doll to aggression, but also frustration from taking the toys away. So in the video, I'm not going to go over SLABY and FREY very much, just because we're going to go over it again, but just know that many of the same social categorization and social comparison features and social identification features of Bandura comes up in SLABY and FREY. If you have any questions on SLABY and FREY from the PowerPoint version, we can talk about that, as we go. With that being said, I'm going to flip over this other slide here. If you have any questions on any of the material from social identity theory in which we are using in-groups and out-groups, or really any concepts from this, please let me know. Other than that, I hope you all have a fantastic day.